Welcome to Chapter 5, Video 3. Let's talk a little bit about the role of fat. The primary purpose of fat in our body is to be used as an energy source. Fat is a very energy-dense compound containing 9 calories per gram. And if you recall, both carbohydrate and protein contain 4 calories per gram. Much of the energy used during rest comes from fat in our bodies. Now, fat is also used as an energy source, particularly during low-intensity exercise and if the body is depleted of glycogen. And we'll talk more about this in a later chapter. Now, fat is also used for energy storage. And if you can imagine, the human body has a limitless capacity to store fat. Unlike liver and unlike the skeletal muscle, when it's full of glycogen, it's full. When body fat cells fill up from fat, the body has the ability to just make more fat cells. And when those fill up, we can just make more and so on. Now, other roles of fat include vitamins, and let's talk particularly about the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. These are vitamins that are soluble in fat, and fat is required for their transport. More will be discussed about this in a later chapter. Now, fat is also essential to other bodily functions. For example, fat plays a role in cell membrane structure, nerve cell transmission, protection of internal organs, and it's an insulation to help us retain body heat. Fat provides both flavor and texture to our foods, and fat contributes to making us feel satiated, because if you remember, fats are more energy dense than carbohydrates or protein, and fats take longer to digest. In other words, fats stay in your stomach longer, and therefore they lead to a feeling of fullness or satiation. Now, fats are not digested and absorbed easily because they're insoluble in water. Now, no digestion of fat really occurs in the watery environment of the mouth. It's very limited. And minimal digestion is occurring in the stomach from gastric lipase. The digestion and absorption of fats occurs primarily in the small intestine. Let's take a look at this diagram that'll help review the digestion of lipids. Now again, the salivary glands in the mouth produce an enzyme called lingual lipase, and it does help break down a little bit of the dietary triglyceride. However, little digestion is occurring here. Most of the fat that arrives in the stomach is intact, where it's mixed and broken down into smaller fat droplets. Now, from the stomach, if you remember, the stomach releases small amounts of food into the small intestine. And it's the small intestine where most of the digestion is occurring. Once the fat reaches the small intestine, you'll remember that the liver that produces bile stores it in the gallbladder that then actually secretes the bile into the small intestine. And that bile acts as an emulsifier. And it'll take large globules of fat and it'll help break them down into smaller droplets. The enzymes can then work on those smaller droplets. Now, the lipid digesting enzymes come from the pancreas, and they help to take our large triglyceride molecules and help break them down into both monosaccharides or monoglycerides and free fatty acids. Now, the lipid digesting enzymes from the pancreas also help break apart dietary cholesterol esters and phospholipids into their components. And once these items are broken down, these compounds called micelles help transport the lipid digestion products to the enterocyte of the small intestine for absorption. Now, this slide just illustrates exactly what we went over in the diagram. So again, in order for fat to be digested, it enters the small intestine, bile is secreted, bile helps break the large lipid molecules into smaller ones, the pancreatic enzymes take those large triglyceride molecules and start breaking them down into monoglycerides and free fatty acids, and then all of those components enter or go near the small intestinal wall as what we call a micelle. A micelle is what is the compound that's made up of all of those byproducts of breaking down that fat. Now, in the intestinal mucosal cell, here's where it gets a little bit tricky. Something I think that might make it easier for you to remember is that a triglyceride is a very large molecule. And remember, most of the fat found in the human diet is in the form of a triglyceride. A triglyceride is always too large to cross any kind of cell membrane. So anytime we need to get a triglyceride across a cell membrane, like in the small intestine, we must break that triglyceride down to smaller components, and then once it crosses that cell membrane, it's reassembled back into a triglyceride. Now, this may seem like an inefficient process, but that's the way it works. Triglycerides are too large to cross intestinal cells. So in the small intestine, what's happening here is that in order to get it across the intestinal cell, we really need to package this a little bit better. And when we're packaging this, if we're adding a small amount of protein added to these lipids, and we package it in what's formed a chylomicron. And a chylomicron is a type of lipoprotein that's produced by the cells lining the small intestine. So a chylomicron, think of it as a specific type of vehicle that really transports the dietary fats that we've eaten. So again, the chylomicron, because it's basically a triglyceride center surrounded by phospholipids and proteins, it now becomes soluble in water and it's allowed to be transported better. So all you need to think about is the chylomicron, again, is that transport vehicle that helps take the dietary fat that we've eaten and it allows it to be transported. Here's a picture of a lipoprotein so that you can get a better feel for what it looks like. Now these chylomicrons, again, they're the transport vehicles that take the absorbed fat from the small intestine. And these chylomicrons now help us transport that dietary fat that we just ate throughout the body. Now, it is a little bit difficult in that dietary fats must travel a different way to get into the bloodstream. If you remember back to carbohydrates, carbohydrates are a little bit simpler. They're absorbed as monosaccharides. They go right to the liver via the hepatic portal vein. Fats have to take a roundabout system called the lymphatic system because they're so large. So these chylomicrons, remember, are the vehicles that took the dietary fat that we just ate. We then transport it through the lymphatic system and then from the lymphatic system into the bloodstream. It's really just an extra pathway that dietary fats have to take to enter the bloodstream. Now, short and medium chain fatty acids are absorbed a little bit more quickly because they don't have to be arranged into these chylomicrons for transport. They actually transport a little bit better. However, most of the dietary fat that we eat are long chain fatty acids, and those long chain fatty acids really need the help or the vehicle of these chylomicrons to be transported. Now, once the dietary fat, again, gets across the intestinal wall and actually gets into the bloodstream, what do we do with that? Well, we don't have a large amount of fat floating around in our bloodstream because the purpose of fat is energy. So that fat needs to be delivered to the cells in the body. And as I mentioned a minute earlier, anytime we need to get fat into a cell, a triglyceride molecule is too big, so it needs to be broken down. It can then cross the cell wall and then get reformed into a triglyceride. So let's pretend we just ate a very high-fat meal, and the chylomicrons are transporting that fat to the cells in our body. And let's pretend it's a skeletal muscle cell that wants to take up some of that fat to use for fuel. So the chylomicron will arrive at the skeletal muscle cell. There's then an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase that'll break down that triglyceride within the chylomicron. The components can then cross the skeletal muscle cell, and then it gets reformed as a triglyceride once it's in the cell. And then once it's in the skeletal muscle cell, it can be used for fuel. Those triglycerides that we just consumed in the diet can be used to produce energy. Now, let's talk about the fates of triglycerides. So again, we eat the triglycerides, and then a few things can happen to that. We only really have a few possible choices. So if we've eaten a meal that contains fat, what we can do is, number one, the body can use that triglyceride immediately for energy. And that's the example I just talked about. The skeletal muscle can take that triglyceride, produce ATP, and then be able to function or contract. A second thing we can do with the triglycerides, or we can make other lipid-containing compounds. But then finally, if there's any triglyceride that was consumed in the diet and we don't need it immediately for fuel and we don't need it to make any other lipid-containing compound, those triglycerides can be stored in the adipose tissue of our body. And remember, as I mentioned earlier, adipose tissue cells can actually fill up with triglyceride. And once they fill to capacity, the body will make more cells. And once those fill, we'll make more. So there's a limitless ability to store triglycerides in adipose tissue in our body. Please proceed to the next video in the series.